First of all, I have to apologize. I have a terrible cold, so with any luck, I won't croak too much and my voice will get going properly in a minute. What I wanted to talk to you about, especially in contrast to the two things we've just been listening to, is marketing. I'm not going to talk about Barclays today because it's too early. I started there in February. What I am going to talk about is marketing as I see it today and how I see the truth of marketing in a world which is changing very fast and what all that means for brands and agencies in the world as it changes. Swallow the throat lozenge, and I can continue. Now, this conference, which I had the pleasure of attending last year and watching, was focusing on change, and this one here too today focuses on change. There are lots of changes going on in the industry, lots of myth about what that means for the industry, in my view. And the myth really is driven by this notion that somehow or another everything changes, so the rules of marketing change, agencies change, everything must change. And one thing I've noticed over time, and I think I was guilty of this when I was in an agency, anytime you ask an agency a question that starts with can you, you elicit the answer yes. So, can you help me with my social media strategy? Yes. This is not always true, by the way. What happens when you take these answers in truth is you're then paying people to learn on the job. And I think the first and most fundamental truth is a good answer is no, we don't know how to do that, but we do know people who can. So on the theme of this conference, I see that it's really going to focus on data and this notion of big data. I like the notion of big data. But there are actually some polls, and I think laid out in the introduction very neatly, that we need to focus on. On the one hand, we have data, and on the other, we have stories, and increasingly brand stories that need to connect with customers in a different way. Very much, I think, the scientist versus the artist, Einstein against Monet in a fight to the death. So, what should you do in the modern world of an agency? I was taken by this headline back in January in Ad Age, tech consulting giants slide closer to creative shop turf. Appallingly written, but interesting. And what that was about is Deloitte and Accenture had entered the marketing services business. And the idea of a pitch which might include Omnicom or WPP as well as Deloitte and Accenture once would have seemed absurd, but no longer. As Glyn Hartman at Accenture Interactive points out, another truth of today. Everyone is coming to the same place, trying to find the sweet spot between tech, creative, and data. And the largest brands in the world were getting incomplete solutions from their myriad vendors. Clients are finding it more credible to reach into marketing from technology rather than the other way around. Now, I read quotes like that, and I am reminded of the industry I started in and the industry that celebrated things like this, the power of great ideas. And just because the channels are changing doesn't mean that the ideas can't change with it. Of course, us advertising marketing types like things like this because they demonstrate the power of purpose and the power of creativity in a changing world. And we'll say that creativity isn't something that comes from data. But Glyn Hartman would probably reply, the Old Spice campaign was a wildly expensive manual execution, and when you ask, how do you scale that on an ongoing basis, the room goes quiet. And he's quite right. So this man in a laboratory, anybody recognize him? I'll be very impressed if you do. It's not Einstein, it's actually Mark Twain. We seem to have gone to our history books, the three of us that are starting today. It's interesting. And where he is, he's in Tesla's lab. Nikola Tesla in the 1980s was the equivalent of Mark Zuckerberg, a change agent and famous. He was techie and cool. He was the man that invented and discovered commercial electricity. And his patents formed the basis of wireless communication and the radio. Among Tesla's closest friends was Mark Twain. Twain was a major investor in technology with the earnings he got from writing, an early angel investor, if you like. Twain himself owned 3 patents. One of his books, a book worth reading, is A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. It's a story where he uses time travel to show modern technology in the past and its effects. Now, I'm a marketer, as I've said. Unfortunately, I get described as many things. The one I hate to hear the most is a veteran. But I guess I am. And like Mark Twain and Einstein, I have gray hair. That's where the similarities end entirely, I have to say. But the one thing I share with them is I am comfortable with ambiguity. And in the world today, you have to be comfortable with ambiguity. Tesla and Twain didn't see the world as black and white. They knew that imagination and information don't overlap. And they also knew that stories and data are two different ends of a continuum we are going through over time. When Einstein came up with his theory of special relativity, he did so by imagining running a race versus a beam of light. He played out the story in his head. Twain, I also enjoyed for this one. Twain likes simplifying things. According to Twain, there are two kinds of people. There are those that say, this is old, therefore it is good. And there are others that say, this is new, therefore it is better. And as he said, both these people are fools. Let's be thankful for the fools. If it weren't for them, the rest of us wouldn't succeed. Now I'm going to continue in my history book and tell you a story about this. Anybody recognize that? I think a couple of agency CEOs out there might have one of these in their collection. This is actually one of Monet's water lilies. And this particular one, let me give you some data around it, was sold at Christie's in 2008 for £41 million, double the estimate of 18 million. I believe this was real-time bidding. An audit carried out of the 240 other Monet paintings would say it was above average price. You could get a water lily painting for less. The analyst would tell you that there were, after all, as many as 240 you could have bought. But the art lover would have said there were only 240. Same data, different set of ideas. Monet was an impressionist. He came out of a wave of artists in Paris who were probably the equivalent of hackers in their day, people who were changing the rules of art. And why they were doing this is because technology had changed. They didn't have to paint in their studio because somebody invented a way of putting paint inside a tube and making it portable. Somebody else invented the collapsible easel, and all of a sudden, people could go out and about and paint what they saw real time as they saw it. And Impressionism, too, was probably driven by a response to photography. Photography had arrived, and things needed to change. So I'm telling you all of this because I find this stuff inspirational, inspired by Tesla, Twain, Monet, the Impressionist movement, the tube of paint, the portable easel, the French railways, and the advent of photography. Let me give you my biggest truth. Marketing has not changed. What has changed are a number of things, and there are three I'd draw to your attention, and let's focus on. The channel, the feedback loop, and the boundary for ideas. When I started in the advertising business, you would do an ad, get it researched, it would go on air, it would work or it wouldn't work, you'd have a spot of lunch, or several spots of lunch, and then the client would say, good job, bad job, and you'd do it all again. And it was a slow, lengthy process of revision and repeating. And if you were good at it, you could do very well. Today, of course, the feedback loop has changed so much. I was going to show you something on this, but in the interest of time, I'll voice over it. This is King George VI at his marriage in 1923. That was radically the first royal wedding ever filmed, and a week later, you could go and watch it in the cinema. In 1953, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II was the first major event showed on colour television, kick-starting the spread of media as we know it today. And people huddled in houses to do it. And last year, of course, we had another royal wedding. Again, people huddled in houses to watch it, but this time they also tweeted. And the #1 trend, I seem to recall, was Pippa's bum. Pippa's bum beating her sister Kate's dress, but in both cases, they drove an industry change that meant those dresses were in stores 3 days later. Same event, entirely different feedback loop, and the feedback loop is instantaneous. I'm sure you're all familiar with these. I love these. This is data presented in an interesting way. This is actually an analysis of, I've seen industries that could easily apply to, but this, in this particular case, is airlines. Airlines in the US and a Twitter feed creating the algorithm that shows you the importance of what people think. Now, you can see that, or you can see the questionnaire. What data would you prefer to work with if you're a marketeer? So for me, this all focuses back on a brand, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about brands and what they are, and I've got 3 definitions here. This is one of my favorites. This is actually from Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. A brand is what people say about you when you are not in the room. That's always been true, but now, as we heard earlier, there are dotted lines around your brand. It's a constant dialogue about your brand. There is no control you can exercise over what people think of your brand. The brand is a creation of all of the customers and all of the people out there. And as I get the daily feeds for my new job, I see how impossible it is to control what's happening. You have to get in a different kind of flow. But the truth is, I don't think the basic questions of marketing have changed as a consequence of that. And let's think about an airline. And in simple terms, I think these are the key ones. Do you know what makes your product or service better than anybody else's? Do your staff know what your product and service is and how to deliver it? Does everybody in the distribution chain understand the product and service? And are you actually delivering something your customers want? I think those have always been the key questions, and I think they will be. But your ability to get information to change things cycles incredibly quickly. The only thing I will say about Barclays, I wish I could say I had anything to do with this. I didn't. Not long after I arrived, Barclays launched Ping It. Ping It is a mobile app that allows you to send money from one bank account to another, originally for Barclays customers only, but now for anybody. So those moments when you all stuck your card on the table to share a credit card bill are gone. You can do it just by sending somebody an entirely secure text. What that is about is listening to customers, recognizing a customer need, and delivering something against it. Very simple, very straightforward, not actually something that makes any money at all for Barclays, but something that helps drive innovation and customer loyalty, and that's something we definitely need. So my second definition, and this one comes from Arun Sarin, the ex-CEO of Vodafone. A brand is what a brand does. I heard him say that one day when he was talking to the Marketing Society. So I rapidly went to Google to see where he'd stolen it from, and I was very impressed that he hadn't stolen it from anywhere. So I must always credit him for it. And I think when I look at things like this, which is a new concept for Nike, I get to a deep understanding of a brand is what a brand does. This is a wristband that Nike give you. It creates data about you, what you do, how you exercise, when you're sleeping, waking, moving, and it gives you real data in real time that you can respond to. And very powerful it is too. Now, Nike make managing a brand look easy. It's a lot tougher than it actually is. But if you go wandering around Cannes, as I did last year, and look at all the things that the sexy brands are doing, there are lots of sexy brands in social media, and they should be there. But there are other brands who shouldn't be there. So remember, when I said earlier, if you ask an agency, can you? The answer will be yes. And I see too many clients being sold Facebook pages and things that aren't actually relevant to the dialogue they're having with their customers or to their business. And I think time to take a deep breath and go, are we doing all the right things in the way of the world as it is? This last definition, I think, fits the world as it is today. A brand has to be seen as a character in a constantly evolving narrative. You can define the character, but what happens around the character means it must change and get shaped along the way. And I think these people have done an outstanding job of responding to what's happened to them, and they also bring me to another truth I'd like to highlight. You will all know that Starbucks lost its way until the CEO returned. And when Howard Schultz returned, he shut down Starbucks for a day and retrained everybody on how to make a great coffee, because that was the fundamental of the business that had been lost. He also reminded people that they were supposed to be the third place. And when he got them to stretch their brains around what that meant, what they decided it meant was customers should get to vote on what was happening in their Starbucks, hence my Starbucks idea. And this is, I think, the real truth of great businesses. The CEO is and must be the brand director. The CEO can hire people to delegate tasks to, but unless the CEO is obsessed about the brand and how it behaves in the world today, it won't succeed. I've done quite well because I've gone 22 minutes without mentioning Apple, but I'll mention Apple briefly. Because Steve Jobs, of course, would be the other great example of that. And whenever you see businesses, look hard at the CEO and see whether they are living and delivering the brand, because if they're not, you're probably looking at a brand that will fail. So, let me end with 7 pieces of advice for marketeers. And these are a mixture of agencies and client comments I've got here. The first thing is there's no such thing as a lead agency. I, again, grew up in a world that said there was a thing called a lead agency. No agency can possibly have all the abilities necessary. No agency can possibly hire all the talent that a client needs. And excuse me. And I think it's poor for agencies to pretend they can deliver and lazy of clients to buy one-stop shops. Because if they buy a one-stop shop, they'll be missing the hot little place, the smart people that can help you drive things ahead. I was delighted last year when Diageo formalized this into, they wouldn't have a lead agency. For each project, the agency that would lead would be the one that came up with the best idea that could be integrated across platforms. Second thing is collaboration, and this is something that has dramatically changed. I have to say, when I look back at my time at Saatchi's in the 80s, I'm slightly ashamed because we definitely saw ourselves as the lead agency. We tolerated, and I think that's probably the word we would have used, tolerated direct marketing and media and all of those lesser things because we thought that what we were doing was the important thing. I find that grossly insulting and offensive, and I apologize to anybody I might have treated like that along the way. Didn't mean to. I have learned, meanwhile, that what you have to do is be fully able to collaborate across disciplines, collaborate across different character types, which then leads to the third point. This I steal from IDEO, and I heard it from them first. We need more T-shaped people. T-shaped people are deep in their core expertise, the vertical, but in the horizontal, they have a whole set of characteristics that makes them able to work in the modern world. They're collaborative, they're open, they're ego-free, and they're sharers. And actually, this industry needs more T-shaped people to collaborate well together. I think the other thing, and it's interesting, I've been a year and a half a consultant, so to return to the client side, and you see how obsessed agencies are with saying things like, we're your lead strategic partner. And I go, what does that mean? And actually, when I drill into that, I always end up saying, no, we have to own our own strategy. We have to be accountable for the strategy. And the orchestra that you have to assemble needs to be conducted by the client. Now, remember, in order to do that, you have to pay absolute attention to the audience and everything that's happening around you all the time. Next thing is I first picked up a brand as a client in 1990, whenever it was, 3, there you go, Coca-Cola. And we had a very rigorous framework, and it was a framework that would be sent around the world, and people had to do everything within that framework, and if they didn't, they would be reprimanded. These days, that's untenable. You have to give people freedom to operate within a framework, but you still need a framework. And the best agencies help clients create the framework, because thank goodness every country is not the same, every culture is not the same, and I hope they never will be, despite what's happening in the world. Next thing, hire and inspire curious individuals. And this too, I find incredibly important, and interesting when you switch industries to see the character types you find in industries where the most interesting people are the ones who are confident in their own ability, whatever that might be, very self-assured in what they do, and very curious about the world around them. So don't know everything, but very keen to learn everything. And I think for any agency or any brand owner, if you've got the best people and they are curious and passionate, you will undoubtedly succeed. And this is where I'll mention open source marketing. Again, an idea I steal entirely from The Guardian, who talk about open source journalism. And if you've seen their recent advertising campaign, and one thing I'd say, best ad I've seen in a very, very long time. But why it's a great ad is because at the heart of it is the truth that today everything is open sourced. And to do that in a company, you need great people. And let me end by saying, remember, there are two types of people, the artist, the scientist. I encourage you to play a game over the next couple of days, and I'll give you some. There are two kinds of people, those who make your life easier and those who make it harder. Or there are two kinds of light, the glow that illuminates and the glare that obscures, and probably the one you'll be most grateful for. There are those who run long and those who finish on time. Thank you very much.
It's always a great privilege to have a speaker who's been on both sides of the industry for a considerable length of time. One question I'd like to pose to you, David, that comes out of that presentation, and if there's something that someone's very keen on, do tweet it now so we can see if a question comes up. I might as well go home, perhaps a bit early to go home. David, what has changed? I mean, you've made the argument that there's a lot of fundamentals in marketing that hasn't changed. What has changed, if anything, is this feedback loop issue. I mean, you know, we all grew up where there were fairly discrete media like newspapers and posters and television. Everything is now sort of converging into a media channel, a single kind of media channel, which also comes back at us very quickly, very fast feedback. Are ideas going to come from a different place in the future? And do you think that all this new technology and new interaction, is that going to be good for ideas, or is it going to suppress ideas because everything's happening too quickly? We won't have a chance to develop a great brand concept.
That was a fantastic question. I think, you know, the ideas have always come from all sorts of sources. I remember John Hegarty talking about a great idea can occur in 30 seconds or 3 months. You can't control where a great idea will come from or when it will come. The real key is to recognize a great idea when you see it. So some of the things I've seen on Twitter, I look at and go, wow, fantastic insight. I think, let me reflect on what you do as a client when you see these things. You know, the whole process that's set in train is quite tricky to change when you get instantaneous feedback. And actually, I think you have to be agile enough to let go of things you obsess about. But I suspect great ideas will continue to be necessary, but I also believe they can come from anywhere, and they will.
Another point that I think really resonated with us as you were speaking is this idea that the CEO has to be well, not just the personification of the brand, but ultimately the ultimate brand manager. And you've also made the point about this kind of collision between arts and sciences, you know, that really interesting things happen when you get that kind of nexus of two streams of ideas. Does that mean it's going to be very difficult to find people in future who can be successful CEOs? I mean, there are a limited number of Steve Jobs, surely. Is this going to be a real challenge for the future to find people who enjoy being at that collision?
Oh, another great question. I think it's interesting to look at who are the CEOs today. If you take the FTSE 100 and look at their backgrounds, what you'll see is an increasing number of consultant-trained CEOs. So lots of, like your good self, lots of ex-McKinsey people doing extremely well, who have learned, again, both sides of the business. Increasingly few who grow up in the business that they drive and run and go all the way. I mean, the current Tesco incumbent, I guess, is a counter to that. But I think finding CEOs who are rounded enough to deal with the world as it is going to be trickier, actually. And watching great CEOs at work, they, of course, are masters at building great teams around them, knowing their own strengths and weaknesses, and having people that can help them as necessary.
One final question from me, unless anything comes up on the Twitter feed here. You're now enjoying the role in a major client overseeing the marketing activity. You made the point that you felt the client had to conduct the orchestra, and that the concept, the old concept of a lead agency, in effect taking everything over, does feel a bit outdated. How far do you as a leading client feel you can go in picking and choosing from agencies, not just in any discipline, but in any geography? I mean, I seem to recall one of the recent Coke campaigns was actually made in the South Island of New Zealand by people who'd only been to Atlanta once. How much do you feel you can get away with now, picking disciplines and picking geographies?
Well, I think, excuse me, there are two or three things. I mean, one, back to Charlie's elephants in the room. One of the elephants in the room is our agencies paid enough money to do what they need to do, and our clients respectful of them enough to pay them properly. And actually, you exacerbate that because, on the whole, most clients are in receipt of an ever decreasing budget and a pressure that says you've got to spend less, a whole bunch of new things happening around you, and even if you want to use things from elsewhere, unfortunately, that's often a zero-sum game. You end up, somebody wins, somebody loses. Now, I think that's tragic because I think it's absolutely magnificent that great ideas can be taken from anywhere. One of my favorite Vodafone ads, for instance, was done also in New Zealand. I think you then have a slightly different problem. When you looked at the cost of producing the ad in New Zealand, it was about 20% of what the same thing would have cost in the UK. When you looked at the cost of repeat fees, they were basically zero, and it was terribly tempting just for cost reasons to take the idea. So, agencies need to get paid fairly and properly, and clients should do that, and then feel free to find greatness wherever it is.
And one final question. I feel I can't let you get away, given your history and background, without addressing this one. Jonathan was suggesting to us that we as an industry potentially are facing some very, very radical changes in our structure, the way that we interrelate with each other, the various different parts of the industry. Do you think that, 20 years ago, we could have stood on a platform like this and the concept of standalone media buying was very new, very novel. The agencies were fighting against it. It was fully integrated. It's now completely established as a way of doing things. Do you think that there is a chance that in the next 5 or 10 years, the structure that we're now used to of the big media buying agencies charging on commission and so on, is that going to survive, or do you think there will be a radical change in structure reflecting the radical change in media?
Yeah, I doubt that the big media agencies will suffer the radical change coming. I suspect that the big advertising agency networks are going to be more likely to suffer change. I find media agencies very willing to embrace the new, hire the new, and work with it, all backed up, of course, by this ability to sell a client media saving as the driver. And because that's going to remain crucial, I think they will remain crucial. And I think the other thing I was going to say, but in the interest of time, I took out of my speech. It's very difficult for a client to stay up to date with everything that's happening around them. And actually, you depend on your external partners to help you. And again, I find media agencies exceptionally good at that. So I suspect a long, healthy life for media networks, as long as they stop doing that, you can have it for 20% less than the other guy.
The benefits of professional curiosity. Thank you to David Wheldon.